kids. One day they're babies. Suddenly they're all grown up. Share those important in-between years with your children in Why Indian Guides, one of the parent-child programs of your YMCA. Why Indian Guides, a great idea, helping families grow together. Sign up today at your YMCA.
Come on, join the Y, 'cause the Y is a great idea.
Pet Sematary deals with some heavy subject matter, which is to be expected from Stephen King. But among the more explicit themes of loss and desperation on display in Pet Sematary, King weaves in folklore, mythic creatures, and dealing with the inevitability of death. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. This is my Church the Cat costume. Church the Cat from Pet Sematary. Shut up. The endless journey of chronologically covering the colossal collection of everything Stephen King continues today. With this, the first video in the Pet Sematary series in which I'll be discussing the 1983 novel, Pet Sematary. This was King's 17th major publication in less than 10 years, which is astounding. Additionally, Pet Sematary went on to be adapted for feature-length films on 2 occasions, once in 1989 and again 30 years later in 2019. There was also a sequel to the 1989 adaptation, Pet Sematary 2, which was released in 1992. And I haven't seen that yet, but I'm sure it will be a horrible trash fire of a movie. I'll be doing videos on all 3 of those movies in the coming weeks as part of this series as well. Pet Sematary, a brief summary. Set in a small town in Maine, to which a young Dr. Lewis Creed and his family have moved from Chicago. Pet Sematary begins with a visit to a graveyard where generations of children have buried their beloved pets. But behind the Pet Sematary, there is another burial ground, one that lures people to it with seductive promises and ungodly temptations. As the story unfolds, so does a nightmare of the supernatural, one so relentless you won't want, at moments, to continue reading, but will be unable to stop. History and inspiration. A great deal of the inspiration for Pet Sematary came directly from real events in King's life. In a foreword to the story, he tells us that the Pet Sematary was indeed a real place and that a number of instances from the story were inspired by experiences he and his young family actually had. According to King, this novel messed him up and distressed him more than anything he had written up to that point. Essentially, he wrote something that was so close to home, literally and figuratively, that he couldn't help but feel an explicit emotional reaction when revisiting the story. King initially wasn't going to publish Pet Sematary, but it became a matter of necessity and obligation rather than a willful decision. He says, quote, "I found the results so startling and so gruesome that I put the book in a drawer thinking it would never be published," unquote. But when he ended his relationship with Doubleday, he owed them one more book, and it was King's wife Tabitha that convinced King to submit Pet Sematary to Doubleday to close out the book deal. Once again, just like with Carrie, we have Tabitha King to thank for convincing Steve to complete and publish something he may have otherwise never released. Some sources report that King was inspired by the story The Monkey's Paw, which was written by W. W. Jacobs in 1902. In the story The Monkey's Paw, a desperate mother and father wish on the magical monkey's paw for their deceased son to be brought back to life. When there is a knock at the door soon after they make their wish, they realize with dawning fear that their wish has been granted and that perhaps they have made a grave mistake. Upon realizing what they have done, they use their third and final wish to undo the resurrection of their son before they are forced to confront the abomination on the other side of the door. As usual, I can't find any direct quotes from King to corroborate the claim that Pet Sematary was inspired or informed by The Monkey's Paw, but it seems plausible that The Monkey's Paw was a story King may have had in the back of his mind while writing. Manipulating mythology. Throughout Pet Sematary, King utilizes and references both Native American folklore and biblical and anecdotes. He builds and expands upon pre-existing belief systems, Christian religious parables, and some more sensational spiritual concepts like resurrection and the physical manifestation of evil. The Pet Sematary, while the namesake of the story, is not in fact the actual burial ground that holds this miraculous power to restore a semblance of life to those who are buried there. It is beyond the Pet Sematary that another, more foreboding resting place lies hidden. According to Judd Crandall, lifelong resident and unofficial historian of Ludlow, Maine, the second secret cemetery was created by the indigenous Mi'kmaq tribes that previously inhabited the region. Side note, for those of you familiar with the book and the movie, it's not actually pronounced Micmac, it's Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq folk don't appreciate it when people call them Micmacs. The Mi'kmaq Cemetery was a sacred, hallowed ground that Crandall claims has since soured and that the ground has gone bad. Those who are buried there return from death changed, often exhibiting violent, aggressive behaviors, and in some cases with cognitive abilities which allow them to know secrets and hidden truths about other residents of Ludlow. Now, the Mi'kmaq are indeed an actual tribe of indigenous peoples with roots in the northern New England region of the United States. However, King took some liberties while writing about their burial customs in Pet Sematary. That's not to say he was entirely off base, and of course when writing fiction, one is not expected to strictly adhere to facts and actual events. But with what I managed to find in regards to actual burial practices and funerary rituals of the Mi'kmaq people, I can see how King may have reinterpreted them to some extent for his story. In addition to their traditions regarding death, King also utilizes a mythic creature from Mi'kmaq folklore known as the Wendigo. The legend of the Wendigo is not exclusive to the Mi'kmaq people, however, and the evil spirit is known throughout many indigenous Native American and First Nation is known throughout many indigenous Native American and First Nations cultures. Although descriptions and interpretations can vary somewhat, common to all these cultures is the view that the Wendigo is an evil, cannibalistic, supernatural being known to invoke feelings of insatiable greed and hunger, to instill the desire to cannibalize other humans, as well as a desire to commit murder in those that fall under its influence. Never satisfied, however, the Wendigo is always seeking new victims. King's interpretation of the Wendigo is fairly accurate and in line with the folklore, but like the burial grounds and rituals, King puts his own spin on the legend. I've included links to videos detailing Mi'kmaq burial practices and another more detailed video regarding the Wendigo in Pet Sematary by the channel CZ's World in the description below. Did King do a cultural appropriation? It was recently brought to my attention that these fictional representations of native and indigenous traditions and folklore fit comfortably within the definition of cultural appropriation. A friend of mine shared this image while I just happened to be reading Pet Sematary, and frankly, before writing this script, it hadn't occurred to me that something like a Wendigo was more than just a scary horror monster, but rather a part of a culture and heritage that I am not a part of and that I am mostly ignorant of. And the use of these topics and imagery outside of their cultural norms and communities can indeed be considered controversial or even offensive. I know words like cultural appropriation and offensive can have adverse effects on a lot of more online individuals, no matter what side of the political aisle you happen to fall on, but I'm a raging SJW snowflake, so it was just a matter of time before I started using virtue-signally buzzwords. But whether you agree or not with the concept of cultural appropriation, or whether it is okay or not, what King does with the legends and burial practices of the Mi'kmaq is definitionally that. Now, before I cancel Stephen King for his word crimes, I think it's important to point out that there was far less stigma, if any, attached to this borrowing of culture and custom back in the day when Pet Sematary was written. Just dressing up as a Native American for Halloween was once seen as socially acceptable, but is now frowned upon and understood to be in poor taste. Were King to write this story today, I have no doubt that there would be substantial backlash. A lot has changed since the early 80s, and I can attest to that since I've been around since then. In fact, when I was a young lad, I was a part of a group called the Y Indian Guides, which was essentially a father and son version of the Boy Scouts that heavily appropriated Native American traditions. We called ourselves a tribe. In addition to merit badges and patches, we earned feathers for our headbands and plastic beads shaped like bear claws for our necklaces. We were taught woodland survival skills and knot tying with our dads. We were given Indian names, and our weekly dues were called wampum. It was a memorable experience that sure seemed wholesome at the time, and it was in large part. I was just a kid at the time, so I of course thought nothing of it, and I have no doubt my dad ever gave it a second thought. It wasn't seen as inappropriate or socially unacceptable back in the early 80s. But now, having made this heinous admission, I'm afraid I must cancel myself, Stephen King, and my dad. And now I must resign in shame from my radical left woke scold knitting circle / book club. For real though, it was a different time, and while I have no doubt it bothered indigenous Native Americans at the time, we were just a bunch of ignorant white guys and kids who had no idea we were potentially offending anyone. I miss those days. Ignorance is bliss after all, but I can of course understand why things need to change. The Y Indian Guides program met its inevitable end after 76 years in 2003, when the practices of the group were reasonably deemed to no longer be acceptable. The group rebranded itself as Adventure Guides, however, and to this day continues what always had the potential to be a great program for kids and their parents. There was, of course, a backlash by outraged parents claiming, and this is an actual quote, that they were, quote, taking the heart and soul out of the program because of a bunch of PC do-gooders. To which I say, shut up, boomer. Stop being such a whiny, cringy crybaby. Things change. F***ing deal with it, you anus face. Final thoughts. Pet Sematary is indeed a harrowing tale that is equal parts a chilling nightmare and a lamentation of the true nature of death. The story is deeply disturbing and is not for the faint of heart, but I recommend the story to anyone who enjoys the occasional emotional roller coaster. The story has the power to force the reader to confront their own experiences with death and to look inward at their own fear, apprehension, and pain with one of life's few guarantees. I had originally planned to discuss the trauma of coping with and the inevitability of death that King writes about in Pet Sematary, but this one spiraled way out of control, so I'll be saving that topic for my video about the original 1989 screen adaptation instead. That being said, I'm going to be stepping away from the Pet Sematary series for the next few weeks in order to focus on the Gwendy trilogy. I've been having a hard time building my channel since nearly all the titles I'm covering are 30 to 40 years old. I just want to start putting out more relevant, timely content to see if that helps gain some subs, you know? So I'll be breaking away from my standard chronological King coverage for the next 3 weeks, and in the future I intend to continue covering King's latest publications as soon as they are released. So next week I'll be discussing Gwendy's Button Box, a joint effort written by King and Richard Chismar in 2017, followed by Gwendy's Magic Feather from 2019, which technically isn't a King story, leading up to Gwendy's Final Task, which will see publication on February 15th of this year, 2022. After that, I'll be jumping back into the Pet Sematary series. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so bash that subscriber bell's brains in to get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty please with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.